The crisp, sharp sound of a custom Mont Blanc pen unscrewing echoed deafeningly against the glass walls of the mezzanine boardroom. I was suffocating, not just from the sterile, artificially cooled air of the $50 million Series A funding ceremony, but from the chronic respiratory inflammation tightening my chest like a vice. I sat shoved in the absolute far corner of the room in a literal child-sized accent chair, my lungs burning, forced to act as the charming, blue-collar diversity prop while my brother used a corporate entity forged under my name as the sole collateral to fund his fraudulent empire. He looked across the mahogany table at the venture capitalists, his eyes completely bypassing me, wearing the terrifying, arrogant calmness of a man looking at a problem he had already solved. "It's about having the vision to build something from nothing," he smiled, adjusting the cuffs of his minimalist black turtleneck. "Some people just don't have the architecture for greatness." The room hummed in polite, complicit agreement. I didn't blink. I didn't cough. I just looked at the gold nib of his pen. They had absolutely no idea that in exactly 14 seconds, the 3 black folders resting inside the senior auditor's briefcase out in the hallway would completely melt his fake empire down to slag. If you've ever had to sit entirely motionless, breathing through the permanent scarring in your retinas, while your own blood tried to sell your physical survival just to fund their vanity, I want you to hold on to that exact feeling. The violent, metallic shriek of a grinding wheel biting into carbon steel shattered the memory. It was 4:15 a.m., 3 years earlier, and the shipyard air tasted like heavy copper and industrial bleach. I am Elena, 32 years old, and I am an industrial welder. Let's just say, the math of my life never added up to luxury. I spent 14 hours a day inside the poorly ventilated hulls of cargo freighters, breathing in toxic fumes because the subcontractor refused to issue proper filtration masks. Every morning, I violently coughed up gray phlegm into a stained sink, my vision blurring from the irreversible retinal scarring caused by cheap safety visors. I didn't subject myself to that kind of biological decay for fun. I did it for Leo. My younger sibling was born completely voiceless and severely disabled, requiring round-the-clock specialized care. I was calculating exactly how many extra weekend shifts it would take to afford a $400 oxygen concentrator, physically patching the cracked plastic of his ventilator tubing with heavy-duty electrical tape. I mean, I wore the same $12 surplus work boots until the steel toe physically wore through the lining and cut into my skin. Meanwhile, my brother Julian was treating himself to daily oxygen therapy in a private hyperbaric chamber inside his multi-million-dollar penthouse. Julian presented himself to the world as a disruptive tech founder. He spoke entirely in aggressive Silicon Valley buzzwords, throwing around terms like synergy, scale-up, and paradigm shift, all backed by massive, totally fraudulent venture capital. He had this carefully curated aesthetic of a tortured genius, carrying the weight of the future on his shoulders. The reality was that he had never worked a hard day in his life. The only genius in our bloodline belonged to our grandfather, an undocumented machinist, who spent his nights hunched over a dimly lit workbench. Our grandfather drafted a groundbreaking, highly efficient metallurgical bonding patent on stained grid paper. It was an intellectual asset of pure brilliance, born from sweat and survival, but he never received a dime or an ounce of credit for it before he died. That patent draft sat in a battered leather portfolio in my closet. It smelled like old machine oil and honesty. I always assumed family required a certain molecular fusion to survive. I thought we were bound by that shared history, that we were protecting Leo and honoring our grandfather's ghost together. I was wrong. Julian didn't want to honor the legacy. He wanted to mine it for raw materials and discard the waste. My father, Arthur, was the architect of this delusion. He was a man entirely blinded by the illusion of corporate prestige, harboring a toxic neutrality that allowed Julian to operate without consequences. He worshipped the fact that Julian was getting his picture taken in sleek office lobbies. When I first started noticing the discrepancies, the strange mail arriving for shell companies, I brought the bank statements to my father's house. I laid the papers on his kitchen counter, showing him the missing funds from Leo's supplemental care trust. He didn't yell. He didn't defend Julian. He stared blankly at his own spreadsheet on his laptop. He told me that Julian was carrying the family name to the future, and that I just needed to be a team player during the scale-up phase. I watched my father actively choose to slowly close his laptop screen, physically cutting off the conversation, rather than look at the chemical burns on my hands. He chose the lie, because the lie wore a tailored suit. And then there was my cousin, Marcus. He was a low-level venture capital analyst who desperately wanted to ride Julian's coattails to generational wealth. He acted as Julian's personal attack dog, ensuring the family hierarchy remained perfectly intact. Marcus didn't just ignore my poverty. He actively turned it into a punchline. During family dinners, while I sat exhausted, smelling like ozone and sweat, Marcus would make sure the entire table heard him joke about my career. He told me that some people build the future, and some people just burn their retinas staring at sparks. He told me to know my lane. He said this while drinking a $70 glass of wine, paid for by Julian's company card, wearing expensive loafers he absolutely could not afford on his own salary. The sheer, suffocating arrogance of it was a physical weight in the room. The only person who ever seemed to notice the reality was Sarah, Julian's executive assistant. She was this exhausted, terrified woman who practically lived at the office, bound by a draconian non-disclosure agreement. During those rare family board meetings where I was dragged in for optics, Sarah would occasionally catch my eye. She never spoke, but she would offer this tiny, panicked glance of sympathy before quickly looking back down at her tablet. She knew the foundation was rotting. The absolute emotional starvation peaked the day I finally graduated from my advanced technical certification program. It took me 4 years of night classes, fighting exhaustion and eye strain, to earn the credential that would bump my hourly pay just enough to cover Leo's physical therapy. I stood alone outside the trade hall in the freezing rain. I stood under a leaking canvas awning, holding my paper certificate, checking my cracked phone screen. 0 messages. Not a single text. The entire family had flown out to a coastal estate because Julian was doing a meaningless photo shoot for a top 30 under 30 magazine spread. I opened social media and saw my father posting dozens of photos of Julian standing on a balcony holding a champagne flute, captioning it with words about pride and legacy. I spent my graduation night sitting on the linoleum floor of my apartment next to Leo's medical bed, eating a generic microwave dinner, listening to the rhythmic hiss of his failing oxygen machine. I realized then that my suffering wasn't just invisible to them, it was the required sacrifice for their comfort. I reached into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I was holding a crumpled, grease-stained parking garage validation ticket stamped at precisely 3:14 a.m. I found it shoved between the seats of Julian's leased luxury SUV when I was forced to drive it to the dealership for him. I didn't know it yet, but that worthless bureaucratic scrap was the exact weapon that would tear his entire fraudulent existence apart. The sharp, acidic tang of expensive espresso brewing in a $1,000 machine hit my lungs. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Julian had summoned me to his penthouse under the guise of reviewing Leo's new insurance premiums. I was standing in his sprawling kitchen, still wearing my heavy canvas work jacket, feeling hyper-aware of the dirt on my boots against his pristine white oak floors. He told me he'd be out of his home office in 5 minutes and told me to grab the file off the marble island. I reached for the thick manila folder. I opened it, expecting medical codes and copays. Instead, I saw the Department of the Treasury logo. It was an IRS form, CP3219A. A notice of deficiency. My eyes scanned the thick black text, fighting through the static of my retinal scarring. Attached beneath it was a stack of corporate incorporation papers for a secondary shell company. The primary managing director listed was me, my name, my social security number, my forged signature in blue ink at the bottom of a catastrophic commercial loan document. I looked at the bolded number at the top of the IRS summary, $3,214,800. $850 in fabricated tax liabilities and corporate debt. Julian hadn't just mismanaged funds. He had deliberately incorporated his fraudulent shell company using my stolen identity, legally pinning millions in tax evasion charges squarely on my shoulders, so his main venture capital firm looked spotless to his investors. He was using the diverted funds to secure this exact multi-million-dollar penthouse, while leaving me to face imminent federal indictment. The door to his office swung open. Julian walked out, casually checking his smartwatch. He didn't even look at what I was holding. He just reached into his tailored slacks, pulled out a little piece of plastic, and tossed it across the marble island. It landed with a hollow clatter next to the federal indictment. "I know you're pulling a lot of overtime," he said, offering this terrifyingly calm, deadpan smile. "Get some caffeine to help with the commute?" It was a generic $50 Starbucks gift card. The arc flashed in my brain, completely blinding my ability to process the reality sitting right in front of me. I stared at the glossy green plastic resting against the federal watermarks. The math of the betrayal was a physical weight crushing my throat. Over $3.2 million in stolen capital dumped on my head, while I was literally calculating how many 14-hour welding shifts it would take to afford a $400 oxygen concentrator for our disabled brother. And his compensation for destroying my entire existence was $50 of generic coffee. I want you to really picture that marble counter, if you have ever stood in a perfectly quiet room, holding the undeniable physical proof that your own blood is systematically sacrificing your biological survival to fund their vanity. How did you stay on your feet? When the shock strips the oxygen straight out of your blood in that first suffocating hour, what exactly did you anchor your mind to so you didn't just collapse on the floor? Drop a comment, because the sheer isolation of that moment is a completely different kind of poverty. I didn't collapse. I looked up at him. "Julian," I said, my voice completely flat. "What is this?" He finally registered the paper I was holding. His smile didn't fade. It just hardened into something clinical. Before he could speak, the front door to the penthouse clicked open. My father, Arthur, and my cousin Marcus walked in, carrying lunch takeout bags. "You forged my name," I said, taking a step toward Julian. "You pinned $3 million of your corporate debt on my social security number." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just looked at me like I was a broken tool delaying his schedule. "Elena, you don't—" "We had to secure the Series A. With my identity? You committed federal wire fraud with my name? Don't raise your voice in my home," Julian snapped, stepping closer, his physical presence suddenly looming. "The investors needed a clean cap table. It's a temporary hold, but if you make a scene and blow this funding round, I swear to God, Elena, I will pull the plug on Leo." The room went entirely dead. I stopped breathing. Julian held the sole medical power of attorney over Leo. He controlled the specific trust that paid for the specialized at-home nurses. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was holding a gun to the head of an innocent, voiceless dependent to guarantee my absolute paralysis. "You wouldn't," I whispered. "Try me," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "If the investors back out, I have to liquidate the trust. The nurses leave tomorrow. He goes into a state facility by Friday. Is that what you want?" I looked at my father. Arthur was standing by the door, staring intently at a stain on the floorboards. He actively refused to make eye contact with me. "Dad," I pleaded, my chest tight. "He forged my signature. I'm going to prison." Arthur shifted his weight, muttering his pathetic, cowardly excuse to the floor. "Elena, just let him handle it. We can't disrupt the scale-up right now. He knows what he's doing." Marcus scoffed loudly from the entryway, dropping the takeout bags onto a glass table. "God, you're always so dramatic. It's just paperwork. Stop acting like a martyr and let the adults handle the business." I was completely boxed in. If I went to the police right then, Julian would instantly cut Leo's medical funding out of pure spite before the authorities even processed the complaint. Leo would die in a substandard state ward. They knew I wouldn't risk it. They had weaponized my love for my brother into a pair of handcuffs. I had to bite my tongue, put the Starbucks card in my pocket, and walk out of that penthouse in total, humiliating silence. The heavy, metallic roar of a commercial diesel engine physically vibrated through my teeth. It was 5 a.m. the next morning. I was at the shipyard. The whole situation was a complete slag fire, and I was running on fumes and pure spite. I had locked myself inside one of the rusted, chemical-smelling portable toilets on the edge of the dry dock. The air in there was suffocating, thick with the smell of industrial bleach and raw sewage. I leaned my back against the cheap plastic wall and slid down to the grated floor. And I just broke. I mean, I didn't want to, but my lungs, they just stopped working. I pulled my knees to my chest and I hyperventilated. The chronic respiratory inflammation in my chest flared up, and I started coughing, this violent, dry hacking that made my ribs physically ache. I shoved the sleeve of my heavy canvas jacket into my mouth to muffle the sound of my own sobbing, because if the foreman heard me, if he saw me falling apart, he'd dock my pay, and I couldn't afford to lose a single dollar. It was just the sheer exhaustion of it all. The absolute biological fatigue of fighting so hard just to keep Leo breathing, only to realize that my own father viewed my existence as an acceptable casualty for a venture capital pitch. I sat on that filthy floor, shivering in the cold dampness of the shipyard, biting down on my own arm as the heavy machinery roared outside, feeling entirely, utterly alone. But then, the coughing fit stopped. I let my head fall back against the plastic wall. I stared up at the tiny, frosted ventilation grate letting in the gray morning light. My breathing slowed down. The pathetic, paralyzing panic began to recede, leaving behind something completely cold and hollow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled parking garage validation ticket I had found in Julian's SUV 2 weeks ago. I smoothed out the creases with my calloused thumb. I looked at the timestamp. I wasn't a venture capitalist. I didn't know how to manipulate shell companies or draft fake term sheets, but I was an industrial welder. I understood exactly how to find the weak point in a structure. I knew that if you applied the exact right temperature and intense, targeted pressure to a microscopic crack, you don't just break the steel, you melt the entire corrupt foundation down to slag. I stood up. I wiped the grime off my face with the back of my hand. I pushed the plastic door open and stepped out into the freezing wind. I was done crying. The sharp, chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner hit my lungs. It was 9 a.m. I had tracked the address printed on the back of Julian's crumpled parking validation ticket. I had to take 2 separate city buses in my heavy work clothes to get to the financial district. This wasn't a movie. I didn't hack a mainframe in 30 seconds. I sat in a freezing, aggressively brightly lit waiting room for 6 agonizing hours. The receptionist at the Federal Depository looked at my canvas jacket, which permanently smelled like oxidized metal and sweat, like I was a literal biohazard. The fluorescent lights felt like physical needles behind my scarred retinas. Every time I walked up to the mahogany counter to ask for an update, the receptionist sighed, aggressively smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle on her silk blouse, and typed slower just to punish me for existing in her pristine space. The friction of the real world is designed to make poor people give up, but this was the fatal flaw in Julian's sloppy arrogance. To legally insulate his main venture fund and maintain his illusion of genius, he had incorporated his fraudulent shell company completely under my identity. I wasn't a hacker trying to bypass security. I was the legally documented primary managing director of the LLC. The bank manager finally called me into his office. He didn't smile. He slid a thick, heavy, watermarked folder across the desk. It wasn't just a loan application. It was the master ledger. I opened it. I looked at the stamped, original, wet ink bank wire transfers from the offshore accounts. It completely bypassed the corporate entity and linked the stolen venture funds directly to Julian's private, hidden biometric crypto wallet. I stared at the text. It read, "Transfer executed, $214,850. Destination, wallet ID J Alpha 7. Authorization, wet signature verified. I took the heavy folder back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat of my rusted Honda Civic, the rain starting to hammer against the windshield, and I just froze. I looked at the crisp blue bank ink on those wire transfers, and this sickening, visceral wave of absolute terror washed over my entire body. My hands, they were shaking so violently I dropped the papers into the passenger footwell, right onto a pile of discarded fast food wrappers. My brain immediately started playing my father's voice on a loop. Elena, you're overreacting. He's carrying the family name. Don't ruin this. Don't make a scene. I literally hovered my hand over the ignition key, staring blindly at the cracked plastic of my dashboard. I couldn't breathe. What if I was wrong? What if this was just normal high-level corporate restructuring, and I was exactly the jealous, stupid blue-collar failure they always told me I was? Honestly, my hand hovered over the door handle. I almost got out of the car. I almost grabbed the entire dossier and threw it into the wet dumpster behind the bank. The conditioning of a scapegoat is terrifying. You are so used to taking the blame that you will actively defend the person holding the knife. But then my eyes caught the date stamped on the wire transfer, October 14th, the exact same day I was begging Julian on the phone to help me cover a mandatory repair for Leo's ventilator. The fear instantly evaporated. I drove home. I needed the rest of the puzzle to ensure the entire structure collapsed. Julian's arrogance meant he treated digital security like a joke when it came to his sycophants. He had given his old, networked MacBook to Marcus without wiping the shared cloud drives. I pulled my old admin password, logged into the family router backend, and initiated a digital autopsy on the synced files. It took 4 hours of watching an agonizingly slow loading bar, my eyes burning from the screen glare. I recovered the deleted document histories for the Series A pitch decks. Marcus wasn't just an innocent bystander taking free drinks at Julian's expense. The metadata explicitly proved Marcus was actively altering the corporate burn rates to defraud the investors. I pulled up the hidden margin notes. The text read, "Edited Q3 burn rate. Deleted the negative compliance audit. Julian, make sure the investors don't see the original." Marcus was a documented legal co-conspirator. I needed the final nail, the proof that my father actively chose Julian's vanity over my survival. Arthur drove a high-end luxury sedan equipped with a continuous loop dashcam that backed up to a micro SD card in the glove box. I knew Julian had ridden with him the night the tax notices were mailed out. I took a sick day from the shipyard. I walked 2 miles to Arthur's house in the freezing rain. I couldn't risk parking my rusted Civic anywhere near his gated community. Private security would have stopped me in 3 minutes. My work boots were completely soaked, squishing against the pavement. I slipped into his attached garage through the side access door. It smelled overwhelmingly of expensive car wax and damp concrete. The silence in there was suffocating. I opened the passenger door of the sedan. The hinges were completely silent. I popped the glove box and pinched the tiny micro SD card between my numb fingers. Then, the heavy interior door leading to the kitchen violently rattled. Arthur's heavy footsteps hit the concrete steps. He was coming into the garage. I was trapped in the passenger seat. My heart slammed against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. I ducked below the leather dashboard. The automatic overhead garage lights flicked on. He was walking toward the driver's side. I looked down at the center console. I reached into my damp pocket. I pulled out a microscopic, heavy-duty tungsten welding tip. I jammed it aggressively into the 12-volt cigarette lighter socket. I deliberately crossed the metallic contacts and shoved the console lid shut. Arthur opened the driver's door. The immediate dead short blew the car's primary accessory fuse with a loud, sharp pop. The car's aftermarket security system tripped. The garage plunged into pitch black as the main breaker overloaded. Arthur cursed loudly. He dropped his keys on the concrete. He fumbled blindly in the dark, turning his back to walk toward the wall fuse box. I silently slid out the passenger door. I kept low, slipped past the rear bumper. and exited through the side alley door into the rain. I got back to my apartment. I plugged the SD card into my laptop. The dashcam audio was grainy, layered over the hum of the sedan's engine, but my father's voice was unmistakable. I clicked play. The audio played verbatim. "Just make sure the IRS goes after her, not you. She's used to struggling. She'll survive it. You have investors to think about." The recording finished. The static hissed from the cheap laptop speakers. I sat in the dark room, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical pumping of Leo's oxygen machine in the corner. I stopped shaking. The stuttering panic in my chest completely vanished. The thermal stress inside my mind equalized. The structural integrity of my empathy was permanently severed. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was an architect of ruin, and my blueprint was absolutely flawless. The heavy, metallic whine of a hydraulic lift tearing through the dead silence of the alleyway made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. It was 2:15 a.m., exactly 48 hours before Julian's Series A signature ceremony. I was standing in the freezing rain behind my apartment complex, watching a privately contracted, unbranded medical transport van lower its rear ramp. "Look, you have to understand. You can't just walk into a boardroom and detonate a federal indictment when the target literally holds the legal and financial switch to your brother's life support." Julian had that absolute medical power of attorney. If I triggered the trap before neutralizing that leverage, Julian wouldn't even need to yell. He would just pull out his phone, terminate the home care nursing contract, and have Leo legally transferred to a bottom-tier state ward before the police even finished reading him his rights. I had to establish a complete structural quarantine around my brother before I could strike the arc. The bureaucratic friction of overriding a billionaire's power of attorney without him knowing was an absolute nightmare. The real world doesn't hand you justice just because you're right. I had to take the physical, watermarked wire transfers, the undeniable proof that Julian was actively using the dependent's trust to commit felony tax evasion, and sit in the bleak, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the county family court for 9 agonizing hours. I mean, my work boots left dried mud on their cheap linoleum, and the exhausted duty clerk kept looking at me like I was a vagrant. I had to beg a gritty, underpaid state social worker to review the documents off the record. When she saw the offshore crypto wallet routing numbers matching Leo's care fund, her entire demeanor shifted. We filed an emergency, sealed medical proxy injunction, but getting the paper signed wasn't enough. I had to physically hide Leo where Julian's private security couldn't simply walk in and flash a piece of paper. I drained the entirety of my microscopic 401 cash, every single dollar I had saved from years of welding, to pay a $4,200 cash deposit to a secure, private respiratory care wing 2 counties over, operating under a strict John Doe admission protocol. But the actual physical extraction in the middle of the night, that was the terrifying part. Moving a severely disabled person isn't just packing a duffel bag. It is relocating a mobile intensive care unit in total darkness. The 2 transport medics and I had to operate in agonizing silence. I stood in Leo's bedroom, sweating through my canvas jacket despite the cold drafts, manually disconnecting the heavy, backup oxygen cylinders from the wall mounts. The stale smell of medical tape and sterilized plastic filled the room. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped a steel wrench on the hardwood floor. Julian was obsessed with control, which meant he had installed a smart hub router in my apartment to monitor Leo's primary ventilator vitals straight to his iPhone. If that machine disconnected and registered as patient moved, or system offline, Julian's phone would immediately trigger an emergency alarm. He would call the police in 5 minutes. I sat on the floor next to the blinking green lights of the medical router. I had exactly 1 minute to trick the digital infrastructure. Honestly, I was holding my breath so hard my chest physically ached. I couldn't hack the system, so I used physical friction. I brought in a cheap $20 dummy router I bought from a pawn shop. I unplugged the main fiber optic cable from the wall and shoved it into the dead router, leaving the medical hub powered on but completely starved of a connection. On Julian's phone, it wouldn't send a panic alert about the patient. It would just display a generic, local network outage, reconnecting error. It bought me maybe 12 hours before his assistant would bother to call the internet service provider. The medics strapped Leo's customized wheelchair onto the metal transport gurney. As they rolled him toward the front door, the primary ventilator battery gave a sharp, piercing double beep. The sound echoed off the thin drywall like a gunshot. I froze. My entire body locked up. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the heavy footsteps of my upstairs landlord. If he woke up, if he looked out the window and saw an unmarked van taking my disabled brother away in the middle of the night, he would call Arthur, and Arthur would instantly call Julian. The screen on the ventilator just hung there, flashing yellow in the dark. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Just the sound of the rain lashing against the siding. I nodded to the medics. They pushed the gurney out the door and into the freezing downpour. I locked the deadbolt of the apartment behind me, leaving all the furniture, leaving my security deposit, leaving everything except the heavy canvas backpack containing the 3 black folders. I sat in the back of the transport van as it pulled onto the empty interstate. The high-pitched hum of the tires against the wet asphalt was the only sound. I looked over at Leo. He was bundled in thick blankets, his breathing steady, completely safe from the collateral damage I was about to inflict. I insulated the circuit. The leverage was permanently gone. The family thought they still held the leash, but they were holding a dead wire. The sharp, astringent burn of pure lemon ammonia practically stripped the inside of my nostrils. It was 10 a.m., the morning of the Series A signature ceremony. I was back inside Julian's penthouse. He had dropped a half-empty $400 bottle of Macallan scotch on the pristine white oak flooring near the kitchen island, and he simply pointed at it when I walked through the door. Honestly, acting nice was harder than the actual planning. I was literally on my hands and knees, wearing my heavy work jeans, scrubbing the sticky alcohol out of the wood grain with a cheap yellow sponge. Julian was standing 6 feet away, checking his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was aggressively complaining to me about the interior options on his brand-new, fraudulently purchased Porsche Taycan. I mean, he was genuinely distressed. He went on this long, exasperated rant about how the dealership had promised him the chalk-colored leather, but in the direct sunlight it looked too much like slate gray, and how it completely ruined his personal aesthetic. He told me it was just exhausting having to constantly manage other people's incompetence. I want you to pause and look at this exact physical situation. You are on your hands and knees on a hardwood floor. The chemical smell of ammonia and spilled whiskey is burning your eyes. You are literally wiping up the mess of the man who just legally sold your identity to a federal prison, while he actively whines to you about the leather color of his sports car. I need to know, would you have the absolute terrifying discipline to keep your head down and keep scrubbing that floor in total silence? Or would your biology just take over, and would you have snapped and put that glass bottle straight through his drywall? Tell me what you would do, because swallowing that pure humiliation, it takes a very specific kind of sickness. I just kept scrubbing. I squeezed the dirty water into a plastic bucket, nodded my head, and told him that sounded incredibly frustrating. I was just preheating the base metal. I had to lower their guard completely. Julian eventually got bored of his own complaints and went into his office to take a call with the investors. I picked up the heavy plastic bucket and carried it toward the laundry room to dump the water. That was when I heard Arthur's voice coming from the balcony. The glass door was cracked open. My father was pacing back and forth, holding his phone to his ear. I stopped in the hallway, the heavy bucket pulling at my shoulder socket. I listened to him execute the most sickening, calculated smear campaign I have ever witnessed. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't acting like an angry patriarch. He was using this completely weaponized gentle therapy speak. I realized within seconds that he was talking to Mike, the union shift foreman at my shipyard. Arthur used this deeply practiced sigh, telling my boss that the family was just setting healthy boundaries because I was experiencing a severe, prolonged manic episode. He spun this entire narrative about how the stress of Leo's medical condition had made me completely emotionally unstable, and that I was fabricating these wild, paranoid financial delusions about Julian's business. He practically begged my foreman not to take any emails, legal notices, or phone calls from me seriously, framing it all as a tragic psychiatric break that the family was quietly trying to manage. My father was preemptively quarantining my credibility. He knew that if I tried to blow the whistle on the forged LLC, my own boss and union reps would just look at me with pity and assume I was having a mental breakdown. He was actively assassinating my character to protect the golden child's public image. I stood there in the hallway. The bucket handle was digging into my palm so hard my fingers went numb. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't scream. I just silently carried the dirty water to the utility sink, poured it down the drain, and watched the gray sludge spiral into the dark. It just confirmed that every single person in this family was a liability. I left the penthouse an hour later, claiming I needed to go change out of my work clothes before the ceremony, but I didn't go home. I took the subway down to a gritty, neon-lit diner 2 blocks away from the financial district. I sat in a torn vinyl booth in the very back, listening to the heavy rain hit the smeared window. I ordered a black coffee and waited. I wasn't going to walk into that mezzanine boardroom armed with paper. I wasn't going to stand there and argue with them. I needed a mechanism of absolute, undeniable authority. I needed a guillotine. At exactly 1 p.m., Elias Thorne slid into the booth across from me. Thorne was a senior auditor for Vanguard Corporate Intelligence. He was a ruthless, terrifyingly clinical professional who specialized in forensic financial dismantlement. He didn't wear a flashy suit. He wore a heavy charcoal trench coat and looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. I had drained the absolute last $1,500 of my emergency credit line just to secure his physical presence for 1 hour. I reached into my canvas backpack. I pulled out the 3 distinct black folders and slid them across the sticky Formica table. Thorne opened the first folder. Payload A, the recovered metadata and edited document histories proving Marcus was altering the pitch decks to defraud the investors. He flipped to the second folder. Payload B, the transcribed dashcam audio exposing Arthur's active collusion and malice. Finally, he opened the third folder. Payload C, the stamped, wet ink bank wire transfers linking the venture funds directly to Julian's biometric crypto wallet. He read the documents in total silence. The diner around us smelled like stale fryer grease and burnt coffee. I watched his eyes scan the federal watermarks. He didn't show an ounce of emotion, but when he finally closed the third folder, he looked up at me and tapped the heavy paper with his index finger. The Series A signature ceremony is at 3 o'clock, I said, my voice completely flat. Glass boardroom on the 42nd floor. They think I'm a blue-collar diversity prop. They have no idea you exist. Thorne checked his heavy steel wristwatch. I will be at the glass doors at exactly 3:15. When he picks up the pen, "Don't speak to them," I instructed, my chest tightening with anticipation. "Don't argue. Just distribute the documents." "I don't argue with dead men," Thorne replied coldly. He slid the 3 black folders into his battered leather briefcase and stood up. I watched him walk out into the rain. I sat alone in the booth for another 20 minutes, just listening to the ambient clatter of plates and the low hum of the diner's refrigerator. I had to keep the shielding gas perfectly stable. The trap was set, the exits were locked, and Leo was completely safe. Now all I had to do was put on a cheap dress, walk into the lion's den, and smile until the timer hit 0. The deafening, pneumatic hiss of the 42nd floor elevator doors sliding open sucked the air straight out of my lungs. It was 2:45 p.m. The environment inside the venture capital firm's mezzanine boardroom was suffocatingly sterile. The entire eastern wall was just floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the gray skyline, and the sheer amount of natural light practically acted as a physical abrasive against my scarred retinas. I had to blink constantly just to keep the room in focus. But what made the space truly unbearable was the ambient noise. It wasn't quiet. There was this deep, oppressive, low-frequency hum from the building's commercial HVAC system, constantly cycling freezing air into the room. It vibrated through the soles of my cheap shoes, Every time someone shifted in their leather chair, or a piece of heavy crystal glassware clinked against the mahogany table, the sound echoed sharply, bouncing off the glass walls like a physical strike. The room was a pressurized containment vessel, completely sealed off from the reality of the streets below. I was wearing a $30 black dress I bought off a clearance rack, desperately trying to cover the fresh, purple bruises on my knees from scrubbing Julian's floors. Julian had meticulously arranged the seating chart to maximize his absolute control. He didn't just put me at the end of the table, he had deliberately assigned me a tiny, child-sized, backless accent chair shoved into the absolute far corner of the room, completely separated from the main negotiation. He literally physically minimized my presence, keeping me entirely contained while he used the fraudulent LLC bearing my name to collateralize the entire $50 million deal. I wasn't allowed to just sit there either. Arthur had caught me in the hallway and hissed that I needed to make myself useful to the investors, so I was forced to act as the charming, blue-collar diversity prop. I was literally walking around the perimeter of the mahogany table, pouring imported sparkling water from a heavy glass carafe into the investors' glasses. Marcus was seated right next to the lead venture capitalist, looking like a complete parasite in a suit he couldn't afford. As I leaned over to fill his glass, my calloused, burn-scarred knuckles brushed against the crystal. Marcus leaned back, his chair creaking loudly, and scoffed. "Careful with the glass, Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "It's a little heavier than a blowtorch." A few of the junior analysts chuckled. Marcus shot a smug look at the lead investor, desperately trying to prove he belonged at the adult table by using me as a footstool. "Honestly," Marcus smirked, looking me up and down, "some of us actually navigate the future and build wealth, and some of us just blind ourselves staring at sparks for minimum wage. Just stay in your lane today, okay? Don't trip and ruin the aesthetics." I stopped pouring. I stood there holding the freezing glass carafe. The absolute elitist venom in his voice was sickening. He was actively mocking the physical destruction of my body, completely oblivious to the fact that his own edited metadata was currently sitting in a black folder downstairs, waiting to send him to federal prison. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, stepped back, and retreated to my child-sized chair in the corner. Julian was holding court at the head of the table. He was the absolute sovereign of this sterile kingdom. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look like a man committing a massive federal felony. He was casually adjusting the cuffs of his minimalist black turtleneck, completely unbothered, actively complaining to the lead investor about his upcoming flight schedule. He literally sighed, aggressively rubbing his temples, and talked about how absolutely exhausting it was to charter private jets to his networking retreats because the catering companies never sourced the right vintage of champagne. He was parading the vanity of his stolen wealth right in front of my face. I felt a slight movement to my left. Sarah, Julian's terrified executive assistant, was standing perfectly still against the credenza. She looked completely hollowed out, dark circles under her eyes from pulling consecutive all-nighters to prep this fraudulent deal. She saw my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the raw biological fatigue of the last 48 hours. Without making a sound, Sarah picked up a pristine linen napkin and covertly slid it across the edge of the credenza toward me, offering a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. It was this heartbreaking, tragic micro-kindness. She knew Julian was a monster. She knew the foundation was rotten. I looked at the napkin, and I felt this sharp, terrible pang in my chest, because I knew that in exactly 3 minutes, I was going to detonate a bomb that would permanently vaporize this company, leaving Sarah unemployed and caught in the crossfire of a federal investigation. I couldn't warn her. I just had to maintain the weld pool and let the heat build. At 2:59 p.m., the lead investor clapped his hands together, the sound cutting through the ambient hum. He smiled at Julian. "Well, Julian, we've reviewed the final term sheets. The capital is ready to deploy. It takes a rare kind of drive to pull a Series A together this fast. What's your secret?" Julian stopped adjusting his cuffs. He reached into his breast pocket and slowly pulled out his custom Mont Blanc pen. The crisp, sharp sound of the cap unscrewing echoed deafeningly in the dead silence of the glass boardroom. He didn't look at the investor. Julian slowly turned his head and looked directly into the corner of the room, locking his eyes entirely onto mine. He looked at my cheap dress, my calloused hands, and my exhausted posture. He delivered his answer to the room, but the blade was meant exclusively for my throat. "It's about having the vision to build something from nothing," Julian said, his voice a terrifyingly calm, resonant purr. "Some people just don't have the architecture for greatness." I just looked at him holding that expensive pen, suspended right above the fraudulent paperwork that possessed my stolen signature. I looked at the tailored suit, the smug smile, the absolute, unshakable belief that he was completely untouchable. I need you to just stop and look at this man. Ask yourself, when a parasite has fed on your blood for so long that they genuinely believe they are the ones keeping you alive, do they have any concept of how fast a fake empire burns when you finally cut the oxygen? Because I was about to find out. Julian's custom Mont Blanc pen hovered exactly 1 millimeter above the signature line. The heavy glass boardroom doors did not burst open. There was no dramatic music. There was just the smooth, mechanical glide of the automatic hinges as Elias Thorne stepped inside. The wet hem of his charcoal trench coat dripped rainwater onto the pristine white oak floor. He smelled like cold asphalt, ozone, and cheap diner coffee. He didn't announce himself. He didn't look at the venture capitalists, and he didn't look at me. He walked with the terrifying rhythmic pace of a professional process server who had dismantled 1,000 lives before breakfast. He bypassed the junior analysts entirely and walked straight to the center of the mahogany table. Julian looked up, his brow furrowing in genuine annoyance. "Excuse me, we are in a closed session. Sarah, who is this?" Sarah didn't move. She just stared at the floor. Thorne ignored the question. He set his battered leather briefcase on the polished wood. He unlatched the brass clasps. The sharp, metallic clack sounded like a rifle bolt chambering in the quiet room. He reached inside. He didn't pull out a USB drive or a laptop screen. He brought out physical weight, bureaucratic brutality. He extracted 3 thick, black presentation folders. You could see the crisp edges of the heavy 100-pound cardstock. You could see the red wax notary seals and the blue federal watermarks bleeding through the seams. Thorne executed the iron bind. He didn't speak a single word. He just moved his hands. He slapped the first folder directly across the table to the lead venture capitalist. He slid the second folder down the mahogany to Arthur. He placed the third folder directly on top of Julian's $50 million term sheet, completely covering the signature line. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur stammered, his face flushing with performative outrage. "Security should have..." Thorne stepped back. He crossed his arms and looked at his watch. The lead investor opened his folder. Arthur opened his folder. Julian opened his folder. I watched the tensile strength of the entire family completely fail. I mean, it wasn't cinematic. It was a car crash in agonizing slow motion. The lead investor's eyes darted across the page. Payload A. He stared at the certified forensic IP log. He saw the recovered metadata. He read the chat transcripts explicitly detailing the fabricated corporate burn rates. He didn't ask for clarification. Rich men do not ask questions when they realize they are standing in a burning building. He just snapped the heavy folder shut. He reached out, grabbed his gold pen, and grabbed his term sheet. He physically yanked it out from under Thorne's black folder. "We're done," the investor said. His voice was completely flat. He stood up. Marcus leaned over the table, desperately trying to see what the investor had just read. Marcus saw his own name highlighted in yellow ink. He saw the exact timestamps of his edits. The color completely vanished from Marcus's face. He shoved his heavy leather chair back. It screeched horribly against the floorboards. Julian told me to do it. I didn't authorize the margins," Marcus stammered. His voice cracked into this pathetic, high-pitched whine. He pointed a shaking finger at his own cousin. It was his login. He made me change the slides. The investor didn't even look at him. He just signaled to his junior analysts, and they all walked rapidly toward the glass doors. At the exact same microsecond, Arthur registered the contents of the second folder. Payload B. Arthur stared at the printed transcription of his own voice. The dashcam log. He saw the words printed in bold, black ink. Just make sure the IRS goes after her, not you. She's used to struggling, she'll survive it. Arthur physically shrank in his tailored suit. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperate to maintain his patriarch illusion. This is entirely out of context. Julian, what is this garbage? They manipulated the audio. Then, Sarah snapped. The exhausted executive assistant looked at the panicked analyst. She looked at the investors fleeing the room. She looked at Arthur's cowardly face. And she just broke her conditioning. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She executed a cold, calculated defection. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her company iPad. She tapped the screen twice. Her voice was completely dead, devoid of any corporate warmth. The Q3 compliance audit was deleted at 2:14 a.m. from your IP address, Marcus, Sarah stated, loud enough for the entire room to hear. I kept the backup server logs on a physical hard drive. I submitted them to the SEC whistleblower portal 20 minutes ago. Julian's head whipped toward her. Sarah, you're fired. Put that down right now. Sarah didn't blink. She just placed the iPad face down on the credenza. She walked away from the head of the table. She walked the entire length of the boardroom, past the empty chairs, right to the far corner where I was standing. She crossed her arms and stood shoulder to shoulder with me. I'm with her, Sarah said quietly. Arthur witnessed this absolute internal betrayal. The structural rot was exposed in broad daylight. His brain experienced total cognitive collapse. He didn't try to defend his son. He didn't try to salvage the deal. He just let out this choked, pathetic gasp. He physically backed away from the table, pressing his shoulders against the cold glass wall, desperately trying to disappear into the shadows. Then, the silence hit Julian. Payload C. Julian was staring down at his open folder. He saw the federal bank subpoena. He saw the offshore ledger. He saw the exact biometric wallet IDs. $3.2 million in federal tax evasion, explicitly linked to his personal accounts. He executed the paralyzed rat response. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the table or tear up the paper. He froze. Absolute biological shock. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. I watched his knees buckle under the mahogany table, knocking heavily against the wood paneling. He started sweating. Profuse, cold sweat immediately beaded on his forehead, soaking into the collar of his expensive black turtleneck. He micro-fixated on the blue ink of the bank stamp. He stared at it like he couldn't comprehend the alphabet. He tried to open his mouth to form a syllable. His jaw just hung open. Nothing came out. The room died. Total, deafening silence. The Havac continued to hum. Marcus was hyperventilating in the corner, clutching his chest. Arthur was pressed against the glass, staring at the floor. The investors were gone. Thorne was already walking out the door, his job finished. The cutting torch had done its work. The foundation was melted to slag. I stood up from my child-sized chair. I smoothed out the front of my $30 clearance dress. I walked the length of the table. Every single step I took echoed in that massive, empty room. The heavy tread of my cheap shoes sounded like a metronome counting down his final seconds of freedom. I stopped right next to Julian. He slowly looked up at me. His eyes were completely hollow. He was shaking. He looked at me, not as a diversity prop, but as the architect of his total ruin. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just looked at him. You love disrupting systems. Enjoy disrupting federal prison. The violent, rattling roar of a commercial freight train horn physically vibrated the cheap plastic booth. It was 11:45 p.m., exactly 3 days after the boardroom collapsed. I was sitting inside a 24-hour grease-stained diner located right on the edge of the industrial shipping channel. Julian hadn't surrendered. I mean, a cornered parasite doesn't just willingly die. It tries to burrow deeper into the host. Using his absolute last remaining shred of venture capital connections, he had hired a sleazy, high-priced fixer attorney to launch a deeply malicious, illegal counterstrike out of pure spite. He filed a fraudulent emergency psychiatric injunction against Leo's new medical trust, explicitly claiming I was a disgruntled, mentally unstable sibling who had fabricated the federal tax documents to steal his corporate assets. He texted me to meet him at this diner, threatening to send the local police to the shipyard to have me forcibly committed to a state ward if I didn't comply. The bell above the diner door jingled. Julian walked in. He looked completely feral. The bespoke black turtleneck was visibly stained with sweat, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were trembling. He slid into the vinyl booth across from me. He didn't even order a coffee. He just aggressively slapped a typed non-disclosure agreement and a formal legal retraction statement onto the sticky Formica table. "Sign it," Julian hissed, his voice cracking with panic. "Sign the retraction, Elena. Give me the master flash drive. Tell the SEC it was a misunderstanding. If you don't, my lawyer will have you locked in a psychiatric hold by 6 a.m., and Leo's trust will be permanently frozen." I didn't reach for the pen. I just looked at him. The thermal stress had finally broken him. Seeing that I wasn't intimidated, Julian's arrogant mask completely shattered. He realized the extortion wasn't working. He violently shoved himself out of the booth. He literally dropped to his knees on the filthy, grease-coated linoleum floor of the diner, right in front of my cheap work boots, wearing his tailored suit. He started scrambling toward me, grabbing at the edge of the table. "I'm the only one who can keep the investors," he begged, his voice a pathetic, wet sob. "Elena, please. If I go down, the whole family goes down. I did this for our legacy. I'll give you whatever you want, just please don't give the files to the prosecutor." I experienced exactly 1 second of silence, processing the pathetic, desperate validation I had waited 30 years to hear. "Julian," I said, my voice completely flat and dead, "you didn't just threaten me. You brought forged medical affidavits across state lines to extort a primary witness in an active federal investigation." I reached into my heavy canvas jacket and tapped the screen of my burner phone. The front doors of the diner opened. 3 men wearing plain clothes and dark windbreakers stepped inside. Federal prosecutors and FBI agents. I hadn't come to the diner alone. I had contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office the morning after the boardroom, handing them the wire traces, and I had been wearing a wire for the last 10 minutes. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the master flash drive, and handed it directly to the lead agent. Julian looked up from his knees, his jaw completely slack. The absolute reality of federal prison crashed into him as the agent placed a heavy hand on his tailored shoulder and read him his rights. Because Thorne's dossier had completely decimated the entire ecosystem, the fallout for the secondary targets was instantaneous. They violently turned on each other like starving dogs, cannibalizing whatever was left to save their own skin. Marcus suffered the exact gritty, poverty-stricken fate he had mocked me for. When the venture capital firm realized he was legally culpable for altering the pitch decks, they didn't just fire him. They blacklisted him across the entire financial sector and sued him for damages, completely bankrupting him. The last time I saw Marcus, he was working a minimum-wage retail job at a high-end, pretentious coffee shop right across the street from his old firm. He was wearing a stained green apron, forced to physically wipe down tables and serve $10 lattes to the exact wealthy, elite friends he used to gossip with. They looked right through him like he didn't even exist. Arthur suffered the absolute public excommunication he had spent his entire life terrified of. The federal indictment made the local news cycle. Arthur's wealthy country club friends, the people whose opinions he valued significantly more than his own daughter's survival, actively treated him like a contagious disease. They stopped returning his calls. They officially banned him from the golf courses. He was completely excommunicated, left abandoned to rot in that massive, decaying house. I heard from a neighbor that Arthur just wandered the dark, empty hallways, drinking cheap alcohol alone, because he couldn't even afford the luxury utility bills anymore. But Julian's legal and financial ruin was the masterpiece. I want you to picture the gritty visual evidence of a fake god being completely dismantled. The federal courts executed a total asset forfeiture. I drove past his building a week later and saw it. I saw the heavy industrial steel chains wrapping the tires of his fraudulently purchased Porsche Taycan on the back of a repo tow truck. I saw the aggressive neon orange federal seizure notices plastered directly over the biometric lock on his multi-million-dollar penthouse door. They locked his accounts at absolute zero. He couldn't afford a high-priced defense attorney. During his arraignment, they stripped him of his tailored clothes. He was forced to wear a cheap, faded orange jumpsuit and those flimsy, paper-thin canvas slip-ons in the county holding cell, shivering on a steel bench while waiting for a public defender. Ultimately, Julian was convicted of wire fraud, but the karmic poetic justice of his sentencing was a completely different kind of prison. As part of his restitution and probation agreement, the court forced him to work a grueling minimum-wage data entry job. He was assigned to a windowless, concrete basement in a logistics warehouse, sitting under flickering fluorescent lights, explicitly forbidden from using the internet for anything other than basic spreadsheets. He was monitored constantly by a harsh parole officer, completely stripped of his disruptive founder title, reduced to a biological machine typing numbers into a system he didn't own. The most pathetic part, though, was the hollow cage of his reality. He experienced this catastrophic cognitive dissonance. Julian had a complete loss of basic survival skills. He had never actually managed his own existence. He had only ever parasitized mine. A paralegal who worked near his probation office told me about a scene she witnessed a few weeks after his release. She found Julian standing inside a grimy, fluorescent-lit public laundromat, a 32-year-old man, sobbing uncontrollably onto the cheap plastic folding tables. He was completely breaking down because he literally did not understand how to operate a coin-operated washing machine. He didn't know how to buy generic laundry detergent. He had no idea how to exist in the real world without a scapegoat paying for his comfort. The structural fatigue of his fake persona had entirely buckled, and there was absolutely nothing inside him to rebuild with. It took exactly 3 weeks for the bureaucracy to catch up to the blast radius. I mean, the legal system isn't fast, but when it finally drops the hammer, the destruction is absolute. The federal courts officially executed a total asset forfeiture on Julian's fraudulent shell company. The bank's fraud division forced a massive, non-negotiable clawback. I sat in a sterile clerk's office and physically watched a judge stamp reversed in heavy red ink directly over the forged commercial loan documents. They completely liquidated the multi-million-dollar penthouse, the frozen private accounts, and the sports cars, routing every single stolen dollar directly back into Leo's protected medical trust. Simultaneously, the court signed the binding order clearing my Social Security number of all the fabricated tax liabilities. I didn't magically become a millionaire. I didn't uncover a secret inheritance. I still had to wake up the next day and pay for my own groceries. But the crushing, manufactured weight was gone. I just got my life back. I was walking out of the federal courthouse downtown, pulling the collar of my heavy canvas jacket up against the biting wind, when I saw him. Arthur was waiting at the bottom of the concrete steps. He looked so incredibly small. He wasn't the arrogant patriarch who held court over family dinners anymore. He was wearing an oversized trench coat that looked like it belonged to a completely different man. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was gray. Look, his entire psychological flaw was that he had lost his own corporate identity decades ago when he got laid off, and he was absolutely terrified of becoming irrelevant. He had clung to Julian's toxic authority and fake venture capital simply because he desperately needed to feel like he was still the patriarch of a successful elite bloodline. He actively facilitated my physical destruction just so he wouldn't lose his country club membership. He was just a deeply broken, exhausted old man who completely failed his children. He stepped into my path, his hands shaking visibly as he reached out toward my sleeve. The traffic on the avenue behind us was a steady, indifferent roar. "Elena, please," Arthur stammered, his eyes watering. I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you when you brought me the bank statements. I was trying to protect the family name. We can fix this. You're my daughter." I stopped on the concrete steps. I looked at his shaking hands. I didn't scream at him. I didn't feel the need to argue or defend my actions. I just experienced this one heavy sigh. The permanent, defensive tension in my shoulders completely relaxed. I realized I didn't feel any anger anymore. I didn't feel any love either. The biological bond was simply dead. I stepped back, completely out of his reach. "You closed your laptop when I showed you the theft," I said, my voice completely steady and literal, "so you can walk back to your empty house in silence." I didn't wait for his response. I didn't look back to see his face. I just turned and walked down the avenue. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Marcus. It read, "Elena, I lost everything. I can't pay rent. We're still family, right? Please." I didn't even break my stride. I tapped the screen, blocked Marcus's number, blocked Arthur's number, and dropped the phone back into my pocket. The digital severance was complete. The dead weight was gone forever. The rich, heavy smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine completely filled my lungs. It was 6 months later. I had used the recovered, legitimate funds from Leo's liquidated trust to build something permanent. I was standing inside a state-of-the-art, fully accessible, glass-walled greenhouse we had constructed right in the backyard of a quiet, single-story house. There were no blinding fluorescent lights. There was no suffocating, low-frequency hum of a commercial HVAC system. There was just the vast, beautiful silence of the afternoon sun hitting the glass panels. The automated misting system kicked on with a soft, rhythmic hiss, coating the broad green leaves in microscopic water droplets. Leo was asleep in his customized medical chair a few feet away, his chest rising and falling steadily. The air in here was so incredibly warm. It was rich with oxygen from the plants. For the first time in years, I closed my eyes and took a massive, deep breath, expanding my lungs as far as they could go. I didn't cough. There was no gray phlegm. There was no chemical burn in my throat. The quiet healing of my biological scars felt like a profound miracle, even though it was just the mundane peace of finally breathing clean air. I walked over to the wooden potting bench. Resting next to the ceramic pots was my grandfather's battered leather portfolio. I unclasped the rusted brass buttons. It still smelled like old machine oil and honesty. I pulled out the stained grid paper holding his original, handwritten metallurgical bonding patent. My fingers, still calloused, still scarred from the welding torch, gently traced the faded pencil diagrams he drew to bind two incompatible metals together under intense heat. I ran my thumb over the exact spot where his hand had rested 50 years ago. I didn't need to yell at Julian or Arthur to validate my existence anymore. As I felt the rough texture of that paper, this overwhelming wave of safety washed over me. I finally understood that the real legacy was never the venture capital. The toxic slag had finally been chipped away, and the structural integrity of the weld was absolute. I possessed the exact same quiet, unbreakable strength my grandfather had used to survive the dark. I was safe. We were safe. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.